the amount of people using Azure nowadays is kind of, it's pretty ubiquitous, right? If you work for a large enterprise, there's a pretty good chance you're using Azure. I guarantee you will take something away from this conversation. So please make Sean feel welcome.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. Quick poll, who here is currently using Azure in some form or another? Holy crap, okay, more than what I thought. So, bit of history. Previously I worked as a penetration tester, then I worked building some infrastructure. Both of these were for the government for about 5 years. And now currently I work as a senior SOC analyst for a large financial institution, doing a bit of incident response, that kind of thing. And as you can tell from the title, I like a good pub rock song. So, Azure. Can't have a good clippy meme without when you talk about Microsoft, right? So, the aim for this talk is basically to introduce people to parts of Azure, give some indicators about things to be aware of, things to look out for, maybe a couple little hints and tips that we picked up along the way. I'm not really going to be covering Azure Active Directory, simply because there's just too much to cover there, and same with Office 365. But there are a lot of amazing talks that already cover that, so hopefully you still get some good stuff out of it. So, the goal. We have this great big Windows 98-esque cloud in the sky, filled with some fantastic services. We have our own on-site network filled with what we're monitoring and checking. And we just want to make sure that none of the badness that may be on our networks or maybe monitoring us or maybe even remotely trying to access us is able to gain access and able to take advantage of our Azure services. Why would you maybe go with the cloud? Well, a few simple questions there. Redundancy, regulation, easy to regulate the risk, and even reduce the risk. Each of the cloud environments themselves have their own particular advantages. Azure has some fantastic features, so we wanted to take advantage of that in a way. And this is obviously what we want to avoid. We don't want to end up with something even worse than what we started with. So, there's a lot of Azure-specific terminology. This is a fantastic resource if you haven't seen it, from eventid.net. Basically gives a comparison between all the cloud providers and relation to typical on-premises kind of terminology. I'll give you a second just to take a screenshot if you want, if you haven't already. I see a camera going. But I'll be trying to summarize some of the more basic terms and give a general overview into how Azure works. So let's break it up and start to break down at a very high level how Azure actually works. So you have some developers. They go, hey, I want to develop something. I want a platform to build something on so that my users can actually access it and take advantage of it. They need tools to be able to access it and manage it and deploy their code, or to actually build the infrastructure. So you've got 3 different methods, which is using the web GUI, the portal. Using PowerShell, you can technically do all these commands and query it all. And there's also a web-based command line interface that you can use. They all authenticate through Microsoft Graph API, which also ties into Azure Active Directory. Then from that, it actually queries the Azure ARM Resource Manager. And the first thing it does is checks an Azure policy. So Azure policy you can sort of think of as a group policy. Very, very important, plays a huge role. And then you can also deploy what's called an ARM template, which is just basically a JSON representation of some infrastructure or a resource. You can then use that to authenticate to a subscription filled with resource groups, filled with resources. And in those resource groups, you can have further policy. So you can basically say, yes, they're allowed to access Azure Resource Manager, but maybe not that Azure resource group of choice. And then you can deploy a resource and your users can access it and life is good, right? Well, actually, what happens if the policy is void? If someone tries to do something they shouldn't. This kicks off a secondary policy called the audit policy, which creates an entry in the event log. That event log then triggers an alert, which you can then get to trigger an automation, which is basically a fancy way of saying code, and you can use that to deploy an ARM template. So a good example of this is if someone tried to access a resource group, you could technically deploy a network security group or a firewall rule for Azure and automatically deploy it to that resource group to stop them from connecting. And if you've got Office 365, it can also tie in with the Microsoft Graph API and then can also leave an event in the event log. So really valuable way of getting some good information out of there. So more terminology for you, I apologize, there's lots. But at a high level, you have a tenant. Inside that, you have a subscription, or if you've got an AWS background, AWS organization. Inside that, you can have a resource group or multiple resource groups. Inside that, you have a resource. So this could be a compute, could be storage, could be a PaaS service, could be SQL Server, your choice. And inside of these, you're free to do it with what you want. They connect out through a virtual network or a virtual private cloud, coming for the AWS people. And inside that, you can have either multiple virtual networks with multiple subnets, or just a single virtual subnet with a virtual network with a subnet. Now, we were looking at this, and we went to ourselves, whole new cloud platform, whole lot of new terminology, whole lot of new things. First thing we should be doing is threat modeling, right? We want to understand what can happen, what people are going to try and be doing, and what we can do to counteract that. So the first step for every sort of new infrastructure. This also means looking at what different parties are going to be using your infrastructure, the developers who are going to be deploying code, as well as some of the users and how they're going to be accessing it. And then we can try and develop techniques to fill those gaps or monitor and see where we go from there. As you can see, we use the MITRE ATT&CK model, pretty heavily used. If you've seen yesterday's talk, you obviously have a bit of background in it, and it's pretty well known. Funnily enough though, Microsoft and Azure have their own developed policy called STRIDE, which stands for Spoofing, Tampering, Reputation, Information Disclosure, Denial of Service, and Elevation of Privileges. So there's no real one-to-one mapping that can be done. Obviously, Azure is tailored more towards their own threat model. Means while there are some really good things in place, sometimes you also have to make sure it's suitable for you. Now, this is the one thing I want everyone to take away from this, is that identity is basically king on Azure. If you have someone else's identity, you basically can do anything as that user, and there is nothing from an Azure perspective that can separate them from a legitimate user. As organizations mature, we're obviously transitioning more towards an identity-based model, so that can fit in really well there if you're looking to that way. But if you don't have that sort of level of maturity, you might have a bit of difficulties. And then on top of that, you have multiple ways to authenticate, so multiple identities, authenticating multiple ways can make it very difficult to differentiate between. Keep in mind, we're talking purely about the management interface we're talking about before. We obviously want to monitor and protect people who can build, change, delete our infrastructure. But thanks to ARM, we have a lot of logs, especially the activity logs, where we can relate everything back to an identity. So we can see user X tried to build Y at this date and time from this location. So, coming back to the MITRE ATT&CK model, a little bit of recon and initial access to see what ways people can potentially come into our network. hybrid access is quite a big trajectory that I think is overlooked. Think of how your own network could already be. If your own network is already compromised and you're using hybrid access to upload into the cloud, then potentially you've just made it easy for them and given them access. Azure Active Directory, as I've already talked about, is pretty well known to have some issues. Obviously, it's being worked on constantly. So just make sure that's locked down very tightly. Hands up, out of curiosity, who's seen OneDrive phishing somewhat recently? I see quite a large portion of the room. Obviously, Azure, OneDrive, Office 365 are all massive targets. And with the relation with identity, obviously phishing now has a bigger severity than before. And one little tip that I don't think many people seem to realize is the public Git repos. So there's actually a few files which hard code tokens of people's identities. So you find these files online, you do a search of Git, you'll find a ton. You've instantly got service accounts that people have set up, SAS tokens for storage accounts, and a bunch of other stuff. So easy access right there. It's not just as simple as enabling multiple factor authentication. Sometimes, well, if you're not doing it, you're definitely already in the wrong direction. So definitely I would recommend it. But you've also got to make sure that it's actually being used. So if you just turn it on and go, job done, it could be that a user actually hasn't gone and set up multiple factor authentication. So you can still log in without having to do that second level of access. So yeah, definitely keep that in mind. It's a possible attack vector right there. SAS tokens are absolutely amazing for access as well, because once you authenticate, you can do everything that the token has been enabled to do. And this reflects a bit of what Sarah Young was saying in her talk yesterday about make sure you change your keys often, because these SAS tokens, they're set, and if you don't change them, you pretty much have full access still. So a bit more recon and initial access. I sort of feel like I'm building on some of the talks that have been covered already here and reflecting a bit of what they've said. So by default, storage accounts, which are, they consist of 4 different types of data that can be stored in them. They're blobs, tables, queues, and files. Blobs are like a JSON dump. A queue is like literally a queue. So really good for working between applications. Files are like an SMB share, and a table is like a NoSQL table. So they've got 4 different types, and by default they're all internet accessible. And then, as you can see from the URL, they are HTTP by default. You can obviously change that, and I would recommend that. You can remove the anonymous capability of them, and they're also pretty easy to sort of work out whether it's a blob, a file, or further. They actually also have a maximum and minimum character count for the name. So they have a minimum of 8 characters and a maximum of 24 characters. Don't know if that's case sensitive, but I've definitely seen some scripts which can be used to brute force looking for anonymously available containers. And as was issued and talked about in one of the earlier talks, the continuous integration and continuous development pipeline, absolutely critical to this. But that sort of comes back to what I was saying earlier about if your own environment's already compromised, you're just going to be pushing compromised code up. The 3 addresses at the bottom, if you've got access to a VM, say you've discovered someone's account through a phishing attack, they can be really valuable to sniff or to prod and poke at. They can give you some information about the hypervisor, about the machine itself, about how its configuration, and in terms of the last one, in terms of the second one, you can actually sinkhole it and take a machine offline, or what appears to be offline from Azure. So these addresses are critical. I'll cover a little bit of protection in that later on. So next off, execution and persistence. Interesting thing is, the Azure platform is built for executing code, storing code, and re-executing it again, right? So coming back to the CI/CD development lifecycle, obviously it's not hard to change some code, resubmit it, and now you've just deployed some malicious code. Especially for desired state configuration codes, you can indicate how a box should be. So if you're missing Mimikatz from it, you can say, hey, deploy it. Although in saying that, Mimikatz won't deploy on Windows 2016 by default in Azure. So I wouldn't suggest that. When you go to create an application, you actually have to specify a service account principal. So it's a bit like a run as account. So you can suggest what account it should be running as. And it doesn't actually have to be just PowerShell. You can actually deploy Python code as well. So really easy way to deploy some malicious code very easily. There are some self-contained repos within Azure, so you can pick and choose from legitimate sources, but it doesn't take much to add your own. So just be careful with what code, again, reflecting on some of the talks from earlier in the day. And obviously Lambda functions. There was an excellent talk at B-Sides Melbourne which talked about the capability that you can do with a Lambda function. Obviously, if I create my own malicious Lambda function, I can use that to deploy code further to as like a persistent store. I can use it to modify the templates and golden images and deploy my own. I can spin up my own machines. And storage accounts are pretty well known for storing malicious content. So obviously there's a few challenges throughout all this. First of all, understanding all the terminology. There's a huge amount of work there. And then sort of tailoring your security program. Azure obviously has a lot of solutions and a lot of tools in place for a lot of this. And you've obviously got your own tools, your own procedures. You want to like meld the two together. You want to find the best of both worlds. You want to take advantage of what Azure has to offer, and you also want to meld it in with your current procedures. And obviously, policy, really fantastic for stopping misused identities. So, which falls back to making sure permissions are correct, access is correct, and keeping on top of where everyone's going, how things are going. On top of that, I'll cover a little bit more later about the environment itself. It is constantly changing. If you're not on top of it, it's just going to make life hard because new capability is going to come out, things are going to change, and if you're not on top of it, then potentially you're opening yourself up just simply because of not being able to keep on top of it. So coming back to that constantly evolving, in the last month or so, there's been two massive features that have come out, Azure Sentinel and Azure ATP. Well, not ATP itself, ATP's been around for a while, but ATP actually released a threat and vulnerability assessment. So if you've used the likes of Nessus or Qualys, they've now got their own equivalent that works across the Azure environment. It'll tell you what software is running, the vulnerable versions of what's running, any potential vulnerabilities you may be housing or running. And then Azure Sentinel is now their new SIEM that's been released. There's a huge amount of changes that are going on, huge amount of investment and improvements that are going on. So obviously, there's like new capability that is coming out often, which can help you. You may not have the license for it, but at least that option is there. So always try and keep on top of what's changing. It can either help you out or at least give you a new option. There is a few problems we did come across though. The most interesting one is probably Windows Defender versus the Microsoft Monitoring Agent. So the Microsoft Monitoring Agent feeds into Azure Security Center to feed a lot of the automated alerts that Azure sort of builds on. It uses a very machine learning oriented program. So you obviously want to feed it the good data it needs to be able to register when bad stuff happens. There's actually a priority though. So if you run or attempt to run Mimikatz, for instance, Windows Defender will pick it up first. Makes sense. It's what you want to happen. It's best case, right? But but it won't get fed into Microsoft Monitoring Agent. So it means Azure Security Center may not be seeing alerts while Defender is, which comes back to overlapping your security, making sure that you're taking advantage of what's already there, as well as your own tools, procedures. And a lot of the PaaS services where you simply don't have that level of control because it's out of your scope, you need to think of ways to be able to monitor them. Fortunately, Microsoft have a few good ways for that, which I'll cover in a little bit. And obviously with things changing, it doesn't take much for something new to be introduced. There is a reliance on machine learning, as I sort of hinted at before, which means that you need to make sure good data is being fed into it. But unfortunately, there is a bit of a 2-week window for that baseline to be filled, which means in that 2-week window, you may not be getting any alerts at all. Obviously, in this constantly evolving agile DevOps environment, that can be pretty difficult to then make sure that something is even up for 2 weeks, nevertheless being baselined properly. But this comes back to monitoring the whole CI/CD pipeline, making sure you understand what's happening throughout the process to see, is there something that we can integrate properly? Is it something we need to consider, to not consider, or do we have other controls in place that will will handle these situations? And then at the end of the day, we've got to consider do we trust the platform itself? It's Microsoft, they seem pretty solid. We're probably screwed if we don't anyway. So as I was talking about, Azure Security Center is basically where all the alerts and events get fed into. This includes some of the PaaS services ones, which I'll show you how to set up in a little bit. But basically, it's your one-stop shop for any alert going off in any of your subscriptions, any of your tenants. You'll see it all. It's pretty good. Has a few false positives, but you can tune them out. But better to be over-alerted than under-alerted. Advanced threat protection and advanced threat detection. The terminology is a little bit of a pain because when I was referring to ATP or advanced threat protection before, I was referring to an agent. They also have advanced threat protection, which is also called advanced threat detection for PaaS services. So coming back to our previous question of how do we monitor our PaaS services, this is the thing for you. It's a simple tick box. They can then provide tailored logs, which can then be fed into Azure Security Center, so you can see if someone's trying to brute force your SQL PaaS instance. The logging diagnostic logs, or the OMS logs, they can be a valuable source, very big, so keep that in mind if you're trying to feed it into your own SIEM. But obviously, a lot of valuable data from your compute resources. And Azure policy and compliance is definitely a requirement, I would say. If you're looking at anything with Azure and you don't have Azure policy, you're already setting yourself up for failure. So this is the policy I was talking about. I'm not going to go through and set up a policy because it's a whole world of complexity. But it is literally like group policy. It can be deployed through JSON, so you can actually create functions that will deploy it. It can be deployed at the subscription and the resource group level. It can be, you can create groups of them together, so you can actually build full multi-layer policies that can be deployed to make life easier for yourself. And yeah, valuable right here. Take this one away. Coming back to the advanced threat protection, advanced threat detection stuff. I don't know how well you can see that, but basically under each of the SQL PaaS services, you'll find a little security tab. Under there, it's just as simple as a little tick box. There is a little cost, but everything's a little cost, right? So are you willing to pay for a little bit more security or not? So it's your call as an organization. I would recommend it. It'll fit into Azure Security Center, makes life easy. There are some limitations, but they could have changed since I last checked, simply because this changes so much. So ATP was released late last year for storage accounts and SQL PaaS. For storage accounts, they only covered blob, but I won't be surprised if that's actually now already expanded to cover the rest of the components of a storage account. So a few tips. Check your Azure policy and your compliance. Your compliance basically reflects how much of your policy has been applied. So if you're not seeing a complete policy being applied, compliance will complain to you and badge you and make sure you hammer someone until it gets done. Check out advanced threat protection and advanced threat data security for your PaaS services, because they could be a bit of a lifesaver, especially for SQL for storage. Practice simulations. It's not as simple as just plugging in and go. Especially if you're overlapping tools, you want to make sure that you know end to end what you can do, what you can't do, what capabilities you have, what gaps you may have, and how you can rectify and restore that. Now, because of a lot of the Azure capability, you can do a lot of automation of the forensics. Not 100%, but it's pretty good. Would recommend at least experimenting with it, making life easier for yourself as an incident responder. Especially like making use of some of the Azure tools. We're going to a new platform to help developers. Why not help yourselves as well, right? Azure Azure Activity Logs are your friends. Fantastic resource for detecting not read events, but any change, any deletion attempt, any write attempt for any resource in any resource group within your environment. Fantastic. And of course, everyone loves a good honeypot, right? So yeah, there was a few lessons we took away, especially relating to the design. You can't necessarily go in with a traditional design in mind. You need to look at the environment, look at what things it's capable of doing, how it will benefit you, and take advantage of some of those. The management plan itself, of course, should be limited to as little interactive activity as possible. So keep that in mind for your design. Don't go giving every dev an account to jump on. Coming back to my point from earlier, permissions and identity are king, so make sure they're limited. Keep them as little as possible, just the scope they need. Anything further, you're asking for trouble. Keep in mind that this is actually just one small part of a bigger pipeline. So make sure it integrates nicely. Make sure you've got steps to cover every step in the process. And we need to sort of learn as a security component to start to shift as fast as some of the environments we're dealing with are changing. So I got a bit of further reading if you're keen. There was a fantastic talk at B-Sides Melbourne about container security and pipeline security. Would definitely recommend that. And there was recently a fantastic talk that covered Azure Active Directory troopers over in Germany. A brilliant read if you want to cover some of the stuff there. And of course, if I had known about Sarah's talk, I would have thrown that in here too, because that was brilliant too. Give people a second just to take that. But any questions?
I have one. You guys are obviously... So how long have you been doing Azure? Like you mentioned, you guys have gone in 12 months?
No, definitely not 12 months. Actually, we're probably not far off 12 months.
So how have... And I'm asking because I know our experiences. How has your team gone trying to get their head around this and get to a point, not only because of all the newness and all the new terms, but the constant rate of change as well? Like security nerds do not deal well with, I set that up yesterday and today it's completely different.
It was definitely something we had to shift. It was the huge hurdle of learning cloud to begin with, from a more traditional SOC environment, and then going, okay, we've got this nice design in mind, it looks solid, we've tested it, and then our change will come out and we go, oh, actually there's something that can help us even more. So now we're starting to have to get to that sort of, well, it's changing, there's new features, why don't we automate where it'll help out so we can keep on top of that a bit better. So it's definitely a concept shift, a change in the culture of the team.
But they're doing okay with it?
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Any questions from the audience?
I understand Microsoft offers IR now. Do you know anything about that service, how good it is? Is it an option instead of trying to keep up with it, especially for the medium-sized or smaller organisations? Should they just lodge a ticket, or is it going to cost them an arm and a leg?
It comes with your support agreement with Microsoft. So it's pretty much you can call them up, you can say, hey, under our agreement, we've been given, I think it's credits they deal with, and you can run through that. They seem pretty receptive, pretty good from the dealings I've had. Of course, I have the full pipeline, I have the full visibility, so having just what they can provide is a small part of a bigger picture. So I tend to rely on my own forensics and own. I had a couple of scripts I was going to release, I just never got around to upgrading them for this, unfortunately. So I might release those later. But yeah, there's definitely some things they can provide you, but I think it's just a small part of a bigger picture. Any other question? Oh, one at the back.
Can you tell us a bit about the sort of policies that you implement or recommend that you might access policies?
So the question was around the sorts of policies that you guys have built or deployed or play with.
The depth of policies is just insane. I'd be here for days just to try and cover like a small fraction of them. So it's literally a matter of going, checking. They literally have like a library you can search across of already pre-configured policies, and you can just go, yes, I want this, or hey, I want to slightly change it. Yeah, it's ludicrously insane. It's like a much nicer version of group policy, though. You don't have to scroll for days. You can just search.
The security baseline stuff that they've worked on and keep updating is actually pretty good now. If you, just in terms of if you're getting started, it's actually a pretty good starting point. It's probably not going to work in everyone's environment, but it gives you an idea of all the sorts of things you should be looking at, just like you get GPO templates and everything else kind of thing. So
I haven't played with it or experienced it, but apparently there's a security baseline equivalent for Azure, and you can pretty much run it and it'll give you the policies you should be enacting or recommended to enact.
let's get a big round of applause for Sean. Thanks very much, dude.